But what I was hoping would happen here, and this is a casual conversation. This is just Agilists talking Agile, right? That we would be able to just have different views and different representation on whatever topic we want to entertain. So I originally thought, well, hey, Peter, you're involved in Agile for industries and maybe in some ways Agile for hardware, right? And how that translates and connects to the world we're more familiar with in Agile, such as software and where it differs. Wouldn't it be a neat thing to be able to just get an understanding in terms of what that looks like? Brian, you're highly involved with leadership coaching. You're involved with essentially the enterprise aspect of Agile adoption. And I thought, well, this is a highly sought out topic and one that has a different perspective as well. Excellent. With that, introductions, let's move on to the fun stuff. Let's move on to some of the topics. So what are we seeing today? What are some of the hot topics in Agile today? What do we want to talk about?
Well, I think that the two hottest topics I see is Agile and hardware and scaling, how to scale. Those seem to be the top two.
Yeah, and you know, Brian, I can't disagree with you. I know you asked for two, Ernesto. Ironically, what I'm also seeing is the hot topic may not have anything to do with Agile, which has to do with the lockdown and how are we working in this new environment, right? And I have heard some like, well, hey, can Agile help us address the environment that we're currently in?
Excellent. Excellent. So why don't we take those one at a time? Why don't we start with this concept of Agile for hardware? Now, Peter, we call it Agile for hardware because it was one of the original terms that was introduced that became familiar in the Agile circle. But I think you might have a broader description of that and how it applies in different areas. Tell us a bit about what that is and how it differs.
Yeah, so we've been using the term industrial agility to refer to that, and if you can picture it, it's an imaginary made-up scale. But if you know, maybe on this side of the scale of product, you have software, and then on the other end of the scale, you have something that historically we might have viewed as about as far away from software as you could be, which is delivering something physical. Well, within that space, there's a lot of other opportunity. The physical one, you know, is the one that we have found to historically at least been the one most mysterious, if you will, even though there's a history of it working well in physical product delivery all the way back to World War II, you know, and what we've been seeing is that many organizations that are producing physical product, they're using homegrown attempts to make it happen because there hasn't been an accessible avenue for them to find good, experienced coaches and trainers, right, to help them understand how to go about doing that.
It is sort of interesting to see things circle back because there was a lot of fervor early on and making sure that, you know, lean methods were really proselytized and spread out throughout the industry. And then I feel like when we got into the business process reengineering phase around the 80s and 90s, I feel like it dipped a little bit, and we started really trying to really stick to a process rather than these frameworks. And you know, now we're kind of back towards, oh, you know, we got to be exploratory and start, you know, not having our plans set at one time, but to modify them as we get more information. So that is sort of interesting.
Well, Brian, I'm curious what you think about this, because another possible influencer here is the reduction of product development timeframes. In other words, like consumers and businesses have become less patient while they're waiting for the next best product to come out. You would buy a product years ago and you expect it to last for 10 to 15, 20 years. And now there's a different mentality, right? That's been building. I'm wondering if, that has influenced why there's now a move towards bringing us back, towards that.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think that there's a lower risk tolerance in the industry right now around products. And so even from an investor standpoint, they want to see something rather than nothing and see it as soon as possible. And so having an iterative approach where you can actually show something and prove out whether or not we think this will be a hit or not, I think it's been very appealing for the investor community.
Right. I like the way you put it, the risk aspect, right? It seems we're in an environment now that you don't get a second chance if you mess it up.
That's right. I've lamented that quite a bit. As I turn on my my Netflix and turn on my HBO Max, and every new movie out is really an old movie that I watched when I was a child. It's just a remake, and no one wants to try out any new idea, so they're recycling everything. And I think that the agile movement is a great way to control risk because you're constantly looking at you hypothesize what you think is going to work, and then you can actually experiment and try it out to see if it really does work, and take that information and then replan. And so I think that kind of cycle is very appealing nowadays. And I think there's one more aspect to this too. It's kind of a counterpoint to the risk, is that we have this huge influx of information available now with all the business intelligence and all the data that we have available. And so when you start doing your planning, most times you can't get your arms around all the data. So you start going in one direction, and then you get a bunch of new data that may send you in a different direction. And so I think that, having a framework that is adaptable and flexible is becoming more appealing. And even in hardware, which is interesting now.
Right. So when you're building a piece of software and you've made this investment, a lot of hours of investment, and then you reach this point where, like Brian said, oh no, we have to course correct. It's relatively easy. Now, from a business perspective, it's painful, but from a technology perspective, it's relatively easy to course correct. Well, if you've been building something physical and there's been an investment in physical materials and tooling, possibly, right, for manufacturing, and now you have to course correct, whoa, the impact is much bigger. So what the industrial agile mindset, right, has also allowed for is, hey, maybe you're not ready to invest heavily in all those expenses. Maybe there's some low cost alternatives we can pursue to do exactly what you said, Brian, a low cost alternative that can still prove out, hey, are we building the right thing? Is this something our customer would really appreciate or not?
Let's talk frameworks for a bit. And let's talk about scaling, right? One of the second topic, which is how do we scale an operation, whether it be in hardware, whether it be in software or enterprise or government. Brian, I know you've had some exposure to Nexus, Scrum Scale, of course. We're both certified trainers. Peter, you've had exposure and training as well in less, right? So when it comes to the scaling frameworks, where do we see the strengths based on today's needs? How does that apply in terms of the individual team level applications that we just talked about?
And the thing I love about Nexus is that previous to that framework, there was an underlying assumption, and it still exists to this day, that you have to deal with these dependencies. And because of these dependencies, you have to do things in a certain order. And when you're dealing with software, well, you can break these dependencies as long as you have a good interface. And so that allows you to do things simultaneously, concurrently amongst different teams. And so I think that we're coming to this age where that myth of the dependency myth is being broken. And previously you had frameworks that had dozens of techniques and spent hours and hours of effort recognizing and tools to kind of call out these dependencies so you can see them and visualize and order things in a certain way. And so, yeah, this flip to getting rid of your dependencies because you don't have to have them is a very interesting trend. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the biggest challenges in scaling is the dependency challenge. Certainly see that. I also see that individuals and organizations sort of get caught up on the methodology versus framework, right? The idea that these are frameworks on purposeful, they're on purpose, meant to be a general guide that allow you to insert the techniques and practices that fit your organization. So when you take something like SAFe, when you take a framework like Scrum at Scale, and you try to apply all of its components 100% as described by whether it be the guide or the body of knowledge, you're going to come against some challenges in the applicability of all of the elements. There is some level of adaptation that is needed, and that requires understanding the values and principles of that particular framework, so that you're not violating the rules of the game, but you're able to insert your practices and techniques. I think I come across a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals that are caught on, hey, are we doing SAFe or are we not? Because we're not doing this part, right? When essentially the key is to look at the overall values and principles and ensure that they're guiding the implementation. Right? That's been my view, that struggle between prescriptive and flexibility and how to navigate the two.
Right. And I think even lightweight frameworks, there's a lot of flexibility, but you still have to apply some amount of discipline for the framework. Otherwise, there's no framework at all. Right.
And those are the rules of the game, right? We have to observe those.
Right. And I think that some frameworks have been interpreted to have more rules. But for example, right, SAFe, I think is a common example that we could all acknowledge, that you've heard people say SAFe is too heavy. But when you look at what SAFe is promoting, actually the concepts are quite sound, right? But the picture that's presented and the way organizations implement that sometimes, mistakenly leads them to think, well, I have to have this, and I have to have this, and I have to have this other thing. And they miss the whole point of doing this in the first place. So back to your original question, I'd like to understand first, well, what are you trying to accomplish when you're talking about scaling? What does that mean to you? Because for some, scaling is simply getting 3 teams to coordinate with each other. And for others, it's HR and finance and legal and the executive team and all of that having to change the way they work. And I think part of this too is sometimes the organization will look towards a scaling model to maybe solve a problem that doesn't exist yet. Right? They maybe just letting some teams figure out how to do it on their own without having to bring in another framework. Maybe sometimes it happens too soon, right? Organizations will pursue that before they've shaked out, hey, what's the real problem we're trying to solve here?
Being cognizant of time and knowing that we blew the time box, because the conversation, as I suspected, would be so interesting and so rich. I think this is a good cutoff point for us to pick it up on the next topic, and where we could talk about how do these apply in a distributed environment when we begin to look at the physical needs of elements like hardware, and we look at the scaling needs when we're introducing multiple teams, and then what does that look like in a global distributed environment, perhaps, right? So fascinating topics ahead. Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Thank you both. I am going to stop the recording here, but not first and not least with a big thank you to Peter for representing the Agile for Industry, and to Brian on the enterprise side. All right. Thank you both.